You want to do what with that bog? Sweetheart. That's what Mr. Cutler said. The first time Tilda Marsh told him her plan, he didn't say it mean. That was the thing that stung the most. He said it the way you'd talk to a child who just announced she was going to fly to the moon on a bicycle. Not cruel, just certain. The kind of certain that doesn't leave room for argument. Tilda Brennan Marsh was 29 years old. Standing in the parking lot of the Callaway County Feed and Supply, holding a paper cup of bad coffee and a printed-out soil report that she'd driven 40 minutes to get from the extension office. She had mud on her boots. Real mud, the iron-red kind that stains. And she had that look she gets when she's already made up her mind, but is still willing to explain herself one more time. Mr. Cutler was 63, had farmed the same 300 acres his whole life, and had known Tilda since she was 11 years old, helping her father move hay bales. He leaned against the hood of his truck and looked at her the way old men look at young women who think they know something. It's not a bog, Tilda said. It's a floodplain with a clay hardpan. There's a difference. All right, he said. You want to do what with that floodplain with a clay hardpan? She told him again. He took a long sip of his own coffee, squinted out at the highway, and said, Tilda, that land hasn't grown a thing worth selling since your daddy's daddy tried to put soybeans in it back in '78. It floods every spring and bakes every August, and everything in between it just sits there being wet and mean. I know, she said, and you want to plant rice and raise catfish. He looked at her for a long moment, then he laughed. Not a cruel laugh, just a tired, disbelieving laugh. The kind that says I've seen too much of this world to pretend that's a good idea. Honey, he said, you let me know how that goes. He got in his truck and drove away. Tilda stood there in the parking lot, paper cup in her hand, soil report tucked under her arm, mud on her boots. She watched his truck until it was a small red shape on the county road, and then she finished her coffee, got in her own truck, and drove back to the 80 acres that everyone in Callaway County had already given up on. Let me tell you something about that land before we go any further. The Marsh property had been in Tilda's family for 3 generations, which sounds romantic until you understand what that actually meant. It meant that 3 generations of Marshes had tried to make something of 80 acres of South Missouri bottomland that didn't want to cooperate. Tilda's grandfather, Raymond, had tried cattle. Her father, Gene, had tried hay and then corn and then, in a moment of desperation, had rented it out to a man from out of county who put in some kind of specialty herb operation that lasted about 18 months before the spring flood of 2009 drowned every last plant. After that, Gene Marsh more or less gave up on the south field. He leased out the north 20 acres, which was high and dry, and he let the bottom 60 sit. Every spring it flooded. Every summer it dried to cracked plates of clay. Every fall the water table crept back up, and the ground turned soft and treacherous. Deer walked through it. Herons stood in it. One year a pair of sandhill cranes nested on the high edge of it, and Gene had thought that was beautiful at least. He died in March of 2021, and he left it all to Tilda. She was 27 then, working a job she didn't love at an ag supply company in Rolla, making decent money and going home to a 1-bedroom apartment that she kept very clean and very quiet. She drove down for the funeral. She stood at the edge of the south field in her good black shoes and looked out at the standing water and the pale, dead grass and the clay ridges that the last flood had pushed up like something trying to escape. She should have sold it. Every practical person in her life told her to sell it. Her mother, who had moved to Springfield after the divorce and had opinions about everything. Her cousin Wade, who was practical in the way that people who have never wanted anything are practical. Even her friend Geneva, who loved her and wanted good things for her, said, "Tilda, you're not a farmer. You never were a farmer. Sell the land and take a real vacation for the first time in your adult life." Tilda spent 3 months thinking about it, and then she quit her job, moved into the farmhouse, and started reading about rice. Now, I want to be clear about something, because I know the question is already forming in your mind. How did she pay for all this? It's a fair question. It's the question that gets left out of stories like this, and leaving it out is a kind of lie, so let me be straight with you. Tilda Marsh was not rich. She had $11,000 in savings, a number she could tell you to the dollar, because she had looked at it 100 times trying to decide if it was enough. She had her father's equipment, some of which still ran and some of which didn't. She had the farmhouse, which needed a new roof over the back bedroom, and had a furnace that made a sound in January like a man clearing his throat before bad news. She also had a USDA beginning farmer loan. This took her 4 months to get. She drove to the county office 3 times, rewrote her business plan twice, got a letter of support from the University Extension Office, and waited. The loan was for $42,000, and she treated every dollar of it like it was the last water in a canteen. She also worked. That first year, she drove to 3 different neighboring farms on the days she wasn't on her own property and did whatever needed doing: fence mending, equipment operation, whatever. She made $12 an hour, and she didn't complain about any of it. I tell you this because the story isn't magic. The story is a 29-year-old woman who did her research, did her math, asked for help in the places that had help to give, and then worked herself down to the bone for 2 solid years. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The plan was this. The South Field flooded every spring, reliable as a clock. Tilda couldn't stop that. She had read enough to know she couldn't stop it, and had wasted no energy trying to think of ways to stop it. Instead, she started asking a different question. What if flooding wasn't the problem? What if flooding was the whole point? Rice needs water. More specifically, rice needs controlled flooding. Fields kept intentionally wet so the plants can grow, and the weeds can't compete. Farmers in Arkansas and Louisiana had been doing this for over a century, on land that looked in many ways a lot like hers. Same clay hardpan, same flat geography, same tendency to hold water like a grudge. The catfish were the second layer of the idea, and this was the part that made people laugh the hardest. Catfish, Tilda had learned, could be raised in the same flooded fields as rice. The fish ate algae and insects. Their movement through the water disturbed the soil just enough to release nutrients. Their waste fed the rice. The rice sheltered the fingerlings from the worst of the summer sun. It was a system that had been used in parts of Asia for centuries and was starting to gain ground in certain corners of American agriculture, though almost nobody in Callaway County had heard of it. "You're going to put fish in your field," said Mr. Vickers at the co-op when she came in asking about water management equipment. He was a big man with forearms like bread loaves, and he was not being deliberately unkind. He was just genuinely trying to understand what she was saying. "In the flooded portions, yes," Tilda said, "like a pond, like a managed wetland that also produces a grain crop and a protein crop simultaneously." Mr. Vickers looked at his colleague, Mr. Stout, who was pretending to be very interested in a display of irrigation fittings. Mr. Stout did not look up. "All right," Mr. Vickers said slowly. She bought what she needed and drove home. The first spring was the hardest, not because anything went badly wrong, but because nothing went quickly right. Farming teaches you patience in the way that only real consequences can. When the lesson for impatience is that you lose money and time you can't get back, you learn to wait. Tilda learned to wait. She had spent the previous fall working the soil on the high edges of the South Field, building low levees from the clay itself, learning the topography of the land the way you learn a person's face over time. Where it lifted, where it dropped, where the water would naturally want to go if you let it. She had help from a man named Mr. Prentice from the extension office, who drove out twice and walked the field with her in rubber boots and told her what he saw. He was 60, quiet, the kind of man who gives information without performance. She listened to everything he said. When the spring flood came in late March, it came like it always did, fast, rising overnight, turning the south field into a shallow, brown lake. And for the first time in the property's history, that was exactly what Tilda wanted. She watched the water rise from the back porch. She had her notebook. She had her maps. She noted where the levees held and where they needed reinforcing. She wrote everything down. In late April, once the water had warmed and stabilized, she put in the rice seedlings. Long-grain variety, suited to Missouri's shorter growing season, sourced from a supplier in Arkansas who had been patient and specific with her questions. She waded out into her own field in chest waders to set the first rows, alone, at 6 in the morning, the water the color of copper in the early light. Have you ever done something that felt both absolutely ridiculous and absolutely right at the same time? Something that you couldn't fully defend with logic, but that your whole body understood? That's what Tilda told me the rice felt like. Standing in her flooded field in April, hands in the water, planting. 3 weeks later, she introduced the catfish fingerlings. She had sourced 300 fingerlings from a hatchery outside Poplar Bluff. She had the water tested first, pH, oxygen, temperature, and she had waited until the numbers were right before she put a single fish in the water. The fingerlings went in on a Tuesday morning. Tilda sat on the levee for an hour afterward just watching the water for signs of them, though they were, of course, invisible. Word gets around in a small county. People drove by on the county road and slowed down. Some of them stopped. Mr. Cutler came back around in May, drove up the long lane without being invited, and stood at the edge of the field with his arms crossed and his expression carefully neutral. "That's rice," he said. "It is," Tilda said, "in the marsh bottom." "Yes." He was quiet for a while. "How's it doing?" "So far, so good." He nodded, said nothing else about it, asked if she needed anything. She said she was all right. He drove away, and she noticed that he drove more slowly than he had the last time. But the attention wasn't all respectful curiosity. There was a man named Mr. Holbrook who owned the property on her western boundary, 260 acres of row crops that his family had farmed for 40 years. He was in his 50s, thick-necked, with a way of standing that suggested he had not been wrong about many things in his life. In June, Mr. Holbrook came to her door. He stood on her porch and did not take off his hat. He told her that he was concerned about the flooding, that her water management might be affecting the drainage patterns along their shared fence line. He told her that he had some drainage tile on that west field that he'd put in at considerable expense, and he didn't want her little project interfering with it. He didn't threaten. He was too careful for that. But there was something in the word project, the particular way he used it, that said everything he wasn't quite saying out loud. Tilda listened to everything he said. She thanked him for coming to her directly. She told him she had a survey done when she built the levees and that the hydrology on her property was entirely self-contained. She told him she would be happy to share the report. He said that would be fine. She went inside, made a copy of the report, and put it in an envelope. She drove it to his mailbox that afternoon. He never brought it up again, but she knew he was watching, and she knew there would be others watching too, waiting to see how the story ended. That summer was dry, not drought dry, but drier than average, the kind of summer that would have cracked her field to pieces in any ordinary year. Instead, her levee system held the water in. The rice grew in the heat, tall and green, against the brown of the surrounding countryside, visible from the road in a way that made people slow down and look twice. The catfish were invisible but present. She tested the water twice a week. She walked the levees every morning at dawn. She made notes. She adjusted the water levels on her control structures, a process she had practiced so many times on paper that the real thing felt like a translation rather than a discovery. There were failures. One section of levee on the northeast corner developed a seep in July that cost her 2 days to repair and lost her a portion of the rice on that edge. One group of fingerlings clustered badly in the hottest week of August, and she had to aerate that section manually, hauling equipment out to the field at midnight to keep the oxygen levels up. She did not sleep much that August. She drank a lot of bad coffee, and she read a lot of troubleshooting forums, and she made phone calls to Mr. Prentice at the extension office, who was, blessedly, willing to take calls at unreasonable hours. She did not tell many people about the failures, not because she was ashamed, but because she had learned something early. The people who wanted to see her fail were looking for reasons, and she saw no point in handing them material. Harvest came in October. Let me tell you what rice harvest looks like on 80 acres of Missouri bottomland, because it doesn't look like anything you've probably seen before. It's not combined harvesters cutting through vast golden fields. It's waders and hand equipment on the levee edges. And then, when she had drained the fields down and the ground was firm enough, a small-scale harvester she had rented at a rate that had made her wince every time she thought about it. She hired 2 people for harvest week, a young man named Cooper who was home from college and needed work, and a neighbor woman named Mrs. Babcock, 67 years old, who had said at the hardware store 4 months earlier that she'd worked rice in Arkansas in her 20s, and if Tilda ever needed a hand, she knew what she was doing. Tilda had taken her number on a scrap of paper and kept it. The 3 of them worked for 6 days. On the 4th day, Mr. Cutler appeared at the edge of the field without being called. He didn't say anything. He just pulled on a pair of boots from his truck and asked what needed doing. Tilda told him. He did it. The catfish harvest came in November. She had partnered, after considerable negotiation, with a regional distributor out of Cape Girardeau who had been skeptical at first, but had agreed to take the fish if they met weight and quality standards. They met both. She loaded them herself in the cold on a November morning when the field had gone silver with frost. When she added everything up, rice yield, catfish sale, minus the operating costs, minus the loan payment, she had cleared a little over $18,000 in net profit on that first harvest. That might not sound like much, and honestly, it wasn't, not in the scale of what the land had cost her in money and time and sleep, but it was real. It was proof. It was the first time in 3 generations that the Marsh South field had produced a single dollar of profit. She sat at her kitchen table that night, with the numbers on a piece of paper in front of her, the furnace doing its thing in the back of the house. A cup of tea she'd forgotten to drink, and she looked at those numbers for a long time. Then she went to bed and slept for 11 hours, which was the most she had slept at one stretch in 2 years. By the following spring, the story had gotten out. Not through anything Tilda had done to publicize it. She was not a social media person, not a speaker, not someone who sought attention. The story got out the way things get out in small counties. Through feed stores and co-op counters, and the tables at the diner in Callaway, where people who'd driven past her field enough times had started putting the pieces together. A reporter from the regional agricultural paper called. She gave him 30 minutes on the phone and answered his questions straight. The article ran in February and described the operation in terms that were technically accurate, if somewhat overwritten. The headline called her a pioneer, which made her laugh out loud when she read it. She was not a pioneer. She was a woman who had read a lot of studies from the University of Arkansas and had a good relationship with her extension office. But the attention brought something she hadn't expected. Other people in similar situations, reaching out. A young man in southeast Missouri who had inherited waterlogged bottomland. He didn't know what to do with a woman in southern Illinois with 60 acres of flood-prone creek bottom that had been sitting idle for 5 years. They emailed, they called, they drove out and stood at the edge of her field the way Mr. Cutler had stood there, quiet, trying to understand what they were looking at. She talked to all of them. She shared her notes, her plans, her supplier contacts, her extension office connection, her loan application, her water management maps. She did not charge for any of it. Mr. Holbrook, her neighbor with the drainage tile concerns, drove up her lane again that April. This time he took off his hat. He said he had read the article. He said he had some low ground on his East 40 that had always given him trouble. He said, and it cost him something, she could tell, to say this. He said he was wondering if she would be willing to walk it with him sometime and tell him what she thought. Tilda said she would. They walked it on a Thursday afternoon. She told him what she saw. She was specific and clear and did not make him feel small about asking, because that had never been her way, and because she remembered Mr. Prentice walking her own field with the same patience, and she thought it was probably important to pass that forward. Now, here is where I want to stop and ask you something. Have you ever been so certain that a situation was fixed, so convinced that the land you were standing on was worthless, that the cards you'd been dealt were the cards you were stuck with, that you stopped looking for a different kind of game altogether? Because that's what this is actually about. Not rice, not catfish, not clever agricultural engineering. What Tilda Marsh did was refuse to accept the premise everyone around her had absorbed so completely that they didn't even know it was a premise anymore. That flooded bottomland is a problem to be managed, a failure to be compensated for, a liability to be endured or sold, that the land was the enemy. She decided it wasn't. She decided the land was trying to tell her something, and she was going to learn the language. And once she made that decision, everything else was just research. By her 3rd year, the operation had expanded. She had leased the adjacent 20 acres, the same north ground her father had rented out to others, and brought it into the rotation. She had diversified the fish stock to include a small pond of bass and bluegill on the far corner of the property, which she operated as a small-scale pay fishing operation in the summers, a modest side income that brought in enough to cover several months of operating costs and had the additional effect of making people feel welcome on the land. She had also added something nobody expected, a small wetland restoration section on the far south end, a 1/4 acre or so that she simply let go. Let the native sedges and cattails take hold, let the water level fluctuate naturally, planted a few species of native aquatic plants along the margins. It wasn't profitable. It was, she explained to anyone who asked, insurance. Healthy wetland margins meant better water quality. Better water quality meant healthier fish. Healthier fish meant better yields. Everything connected to everything else. The sandhill cranes came back that 3rd autumn, 2 of them, same as before, picking their way along the edge of the restoration section in the early morning. Tilda watched them from the levee with her coffee. She thought about her father. She thought about how he had loved those cranes, how he had called them beautiful, how he had been standing on this same ground, looking at this same water, and had not quite been able to see what it could become. She did not think about it with sadness exactly, more with a kind of ache that was also gratitude. He had kept the land. He had refused to sell it, even when the practical thing was to sell it. He had passed it to her, And she had been stubborn enough, or reckless enough, or maybe just desperate enough to take it seriously, she thought. I wish you could see this, Dad. And then she put down her coffee and walked out onto the levee because the morning water check didn't do itself. And the rice wasn't going to plant itself in 3 weeks. And she had a call with Mr. Prentice at 9 last October when the second harvest came in. Rice yields up 22% from year 1, catfish sales up 31%, the pay fishing income covering nearly half her annual equipment maintenance. Tilda Marsh drove into Callaway to the feed and supply for supplies. Mr. Cutler was there, as he usually was on Tuesday mornings, getting coffee from the machine by the front counter. He watched her come through the door. He looked at her, at the mud on her boots and the notebook she always carried and the way she walked, which was the walk of someone who knows what her day is going to hold and isn't afraid of any of it. He poured a second cup of coffee from the machine and held it out to her. She took it. How's the bottom field? He asked. Real good, she said. He nodded. He looked out the window for a moment at the county road, the flat fields, the October sky. Your daddy would have gotten a kick out of it, he said. Tilda wrapped both hands around the paper cup. The coffee was terrible, same as it always was. Yeah, she said, he really would have. They stood there a moment in that comfortable silence that exists between people who understand the same land, and then Mr. Cutler headed back to his truck and Tilda went to find her supplies, and the morning went on the way mornings in Callaway County always do, quietly, without ceremony, under a wide and ordinary sky. But something had changed, not dramatically, not in any way you could point to or photograph, just quietly, the way the land itself changes. One season at a time, one decision at a time, until one morning you look out over a field that everyone had given up on, and you see something growing there, real and stubborn and entirely unexpected. And you think, maybe the land knew all along. Maybe it just needed someone willing to listen.